You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Many of the protesters who marched in Springfield and across the state this week called for change at the ballot box and in our laws. Joining us now to take a look at what some of that momentum, what some of that change might one day look like is Audra Wilson from the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, joining us from her home office in Chicago. Audra, good to have you with us.
Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Yeah, first of all, before we jump into some of this, I understand the Shriver Center focuses on racial inequality, structural racism, things of that nature. But how are you doing? If you can, just recap for us what you felt, what you've gone through, what you've seen this week.
Well, I appreciate you asking, and it's been challenging. I was so excited to return to Shriver. I am the new president and CEO, and I'm an alumnus of the organization. And so I was so looking forward to my first day and starting back at the great work that it does. But leading up to my first day is when I basically watched our country erupt. It had come to this fever pitch where people were so angry and tired of feeling devalued, of feeling disrespected. And you saw these protests erupting and emerging all around the country. And so that sentiment has even carried through with my amazing team. Each and every one of us has felt this personally. You have people on staff who are raising Black boys, and Black children, but especially young Black boys. You have individuals on our team who are coming from the communities that have been the most impacted, not only by this crisis of violence, but also with the COVID pandemic. So as we are advocates and we are professionals and we're able to talk about that in professional capacity, it was impossible to engage in this sort of dialogue about what happens next without acknowledging how this was impacting each and every one of us personally.
And I suppose I owe you an apology. I forgot to mention the transition and your new career move right as we were introducing you. But yeah, a new venture as you return to the Shriver Center there. Perhaps a renewed sense of purpose in these days. But you used a word that strikes me, devalued. And it seems that is the core intent of our pursuit of justice after all, is that everyone is valued the same. We have this notion in this nation that everyone is created equal, but then they get their paycheck, or then they show up in court, or then they interact with police, and those different interactions can look a lot different for different people based on where they live, perhaps based on how much they earn or how they look.
Absolutely, and I think this is a point that's so important to underscore. So you're thinking about, it's addressing structural racism. And structural racism has resulted in Black and Brown communities receiving less in terms of quality education, employment, healthcare, housing, and resources. They are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. They are dealing with environmental issues. And it's pervasive. So when we think of, for example, we jumped into the fray, obviously, as it pertained to COVID-19. Because we address health disparities. And we know that COVID-19 has been a serious threat to all Americans. And so, of course, we have been working 24/7 to be working on protecting our communities. But the thing is that this virus, though the virus doesn't discriminate, human beings do. So when you have structural inequalities in your healthcare system, imagine that a virus that is already consuming our nation, consuming our world, because it is so virulent. Imagine the disproportionate impact on communities that are already disadvantaged, communities that are already lacking resources, people who are already underinsured or uninsured. So that's where the connection of structural racism, that's how it feeds into this narrative. So anything that's impacting the average American may be impacting particular segments of our population even more because of that structural inequality.
It seems there's also a divide in the way political parties discuss this issue. There's a divide in the way sometimes regions of the nation try and look at these issues. I notice some folks will look at here and now and look at one moment in time as sort of a snapshot and extrapolate from that whatever they want. And others bring to the conversation more of a historical lens, and they say that something's built up over time. I think that might be what you're referring to when you say structural racism and some of these issues. Give us, I think you've touched on some of this here, but in terms of where we go from here, when protesters and activists took to the streets and called for change at the ballot box, or said that our elected officials, in both parties in some cases, haven't been sensitive enough to the needs of people of color and minority communities, and in some cases have only showed up when they needed their votes and then left when those folks needed their voices to be heard. What are some specific changes that you would qualify as progress that could happen in the near future? Are there any things within reach? We heard some activists complain and express regret or anger even that it's taken so long to get so little done. What are some things that can happen?
Well, of course. I mean, history, and you've heard, by ignoring history, and I'm paraphrasing, we're bound to it's bound to repeat itself, and that's the reason why it's so important to put things into a historical context as we're thinking about how we effectuate strategies once and for all that impact and that will benefit those who are most at need. There are bright spots in this, if in fact the will of the people, as you've seen and heard, is really carried out. So as it pertains to the pandemic crisis and its impact on communities of color, what's going to be really important now is that we're starting to really evaluate these disproportionate impacts on these communities and making sure that the resources are being properly apportioned to them. So for example, there is a bill that's been introduced, or that will be introduced by Senator Cory Booker and Congresswoman Robin Kelly, that is for relief, that provides money for organizations that are doing COVID impact work in communities of color. And this is extraordinarily important because it will underscore the work that they do. It'll give them much needed resources so that they can attend to the very communities that are the hardest hit. There's been many discussions about how we can, for all Americans who are low income and low wage workers, who can get more income supports. And so we're talking about individuals who lack affordable childcare, individuals who lack affordable housing options. These income supports are crucial, and this transcends race and ethnicity. I mean, we're talking about some of the lowest wage workers are the very ones who have been on the front lines during this whole crisis. And so it's very important that we look at these laws, especially from a state and a federal perspective, that can bolster the income supports that they need to be able to do their jobs and the jobs that so many of us are relying upon. There are state level affirmative policies to support working families and making affordable healthcare accessible to all, and protecting housing and shelter. So these are things that we are doing as advocates, and that we are promoting and leading the charge with advocates around the country. So quite frankly, there's a lot that can be done. I'm very proud to see that, especially in the wake of racial violence, because that's yet another kind of level of discussion about what we are going to do in terms of what has been happening, not just only by law enforcement, but quite frankly, the tenor of the country has been such that this indiscriminate killing of Black people has really reached a horrible level. I mean, it should never have been there, but now to see so many people marching the streets, these multiracial groups and multi-ethnic and aged that are marching in protest and making demands, quite frankly, of our administration to say, no longer are we going to tolerate this rhetoric, this inflammatory rhetoric. These are Americans, these are our peers, these are people we should be standing side by side and supporting, and not tolerating the things that are happening. So that is going to be a catalyst, quite frankly, I think, for a lot of reevaluation of policies and procedures, especially among police departments, we hope to see. And then just in general about, what are some of the things that need to happen from this moment? Because it's a very important moment in history. And so how we move out of that is going to be, quite frankly, that's going to set the course for what changes happen.
Certainly. I want to ask you one question. You mentioned racial violence. Do you see a connection between racial violence and value or earning power and poverty? Do you see any connection between those two topics?
So just to be clear, when we talk about violence perpetuated against people because of the color of their skin, that's how I'm defining violence, racial violence.
Right.
It's certainly no coincidence that, there are inextricable links between poverty and racism. And unfortunately, when you're in communities that are already suffering, these are communities that can be targeted. So we'll see a type of policing in these communities that, instead of being collaborative, working in concert with the communities, it's very authoritarian, and they're not creating partnerships and relationships to be working in sync to make sure they're keeping communities safe. And so, in that aspect, there's very much a link between that. And so, people want safety for their communities, make no mistake, but they also want to know that they can have a relationship with law enforcement that is affirmative, that is positive, not one that's antagonistic, and not one where they have to fear the very people who, quite frankly, are supposed to be there to serve and protect. In Chicago, there have been pushes, quite frankly, to start to better the relationship between community and law enforcement, and proposals like making sure that you're living in the community, or that you have worked within the community for some period of time, so that you've established that sort of the bond, and you don't see everyone as a potential threat, but you see the people who are just citizens who, quite frankly, are just trying to live and take care of their families and earn a living, because that's the vast majority of all of us. And there are examples of that around the country. And we, quite frankly, have a new police chief, too, who's trying to bring a lot of that in, more of that community policing model. But we're going to need to see that in order to, at least as it pertains to the violence perpetuated by law enforcement, we're going to need to see more of those initiatives. But on the broader scale, the rhetoric and the devaluing of Black and brown lives, that's going to have to be multifaceted in terms of how we curb that, how we address that. And so that's it's going to be a longer fight, but I think, again, there's will, now that we've seen just the anger that there is. And I'm pleased to see that people marching peacefully in the streets are a rainbow coalition of sorts. They are angry and they are fed up, and because this is such a terrible reflection of our country, and it's a terrible reflection on all of us as Americans. It's not just about people of color. It is a terrible reflection on our entire country, and it is a blight, and many people are fed up.
Yeah, a lot of conversations started this week between parents and children, between neighbors, and perhaps between even strangers. But Audra Wilson with the Shriver Center on Poverty Law joining us to help fill in some of those conversations and see where they might go from here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we're back in just a moment.